Well, that's a message, folks. All right. The next speaker. Oh boy, sorry guys. The next speaker is Senator Jennifer Fielder, and I am pleased. I am greatly pleased to have her here. I've been kind of hard on her this last year, and I had to tell her that I still have a hard time trusting politicians, and that's going to be a hard one to get over. But she's gaining. She's gaining good. So welcome, Senator Fielder.
Just a word of advice, never trust a politician. But I don't consider myself a politician, but an elected representative of the people of Sanders County and Mineral County and part of Flathead County and part of Missoula County. I'm one of you, and it's my privilege to have been elected by you and to go stand up in rooms full of politicians, speak the truth, and to try to help them to understand more about what's going on for those that don't get it. There are some good ones in the Montana legislature, let me tell you. Representative Teresa Manzella is here. Would you stand up, Teresa? She's a horsewoman, and she doesn't take no bull. So, in the legislative process, you do become somewhat transformed. I'm a regular person, but I have a higher responsibility because I'm held to a higher standard when I do speak. And I take that seriously. So, I'm not quick to jump on bandwagons. I do my homework, I do a lot of homework. And I appreciate the people that provide me with information and concerns and bring concerns to my attention like the Ryan family has. So I started doing some homework on what caused the uprising in Burns, Oregon. Why did the Bundys and all these other people go there and occupy that bird refuge, risk their lives to do it? And so I started to lay out the facts of the Hammond case by reviewing the court records, the jury verdicts, the government records. I interviewed both of the Hammond wives, Stephen's wife and White's wife. And here's what I found. And these are facts that I'm laying out into a resolution that will go before the President of the United States and the U.S. Congress. So, I don't normally read in front of an audience, but it's very factual and I want to make sure that I'm clear on that. So I'm going to read it. In the state of Oregon, federal agencies sentenced rancher Dwight Hammond, now 78, and his son Stephen Hammond, now 49, to 5 years in federal prison for the crime of utilizing common range management fires that spread slightly off of their own land and onto a small portion of adjacent public land, each causing less than $1,000 in damage. The charges and penalties levied against the Hammonds were extraordinarily severe, especially in light of the fact that federal land managers have, on numerous occasions, accidentally and purposely at times, burned thousands of acres of public land and private land, including homes, without consequence to the agency or its employees, and without compensation to the landowners whose property they destroyed. At the criminal trial of the Hammonds, the federal government's own witness actually testified that the fire that Dwight and Stephen were both found guilty of igniting actually improved the range, and that the Bureau of Land Management committed no suppression resources to the fire. In other words, they didn't spend any money on that fire, and the fire improved the range. Curiously, the charges against Dwight and Stephen Hammond were preceded by a long period in which the Hammonds had been publicly critical of federal land managers' actions. For decades, the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had deployed federal administrative powers to punitively regulate and prosecute the Hammond family in what now appear to be efforts to take over the Hammonds ranch and water rights. For 20 years, the Hammonds warded off federal land managers' attempts to block them from trailing their cattle on to their lawfully held grazing lands via historic stock driveways that were verified in historical records. In 1994, the BLM and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service falsely arrested Dwight Hammond for protecting the Hammonds family, their legally owned water rights, and the Hammonds subsequently prevailed in state court by proving their vested water right claims. Between 1994 and 2006, even though the Hammonds held federal grazing permits that were attached to their statutorily protected grazing preference and their vested stock water rights, federal land managers stripped them of 3 BLM grazing permits and 1 Malheur National Wildlife Refuge grazing permit, thereby systematically gutting the economic viability of the Hammond Ranch. In 2001, after receiving BLM permission, Dwight and Stephen Hammond started a prescribed range management burn on their private land that accidentally spilled over to about 137 acres of adjoining public land upon which the Hammonds held the grazing rights and managed. However, Stephen reported that the fire had spread beyond his own property boundary. The government expert testified that the fire improved the range, and at the time the BLM didn't cite him for it. It wasn't for 9 years until they decided to cite him for it. So that was the 2001 fire. In 2006, during a violent thunderstorm, lightning ignited a wildfire that seriously threatened to wipe out the Hammonds' winter feeding grounds. And in a widely accepted firefighting practice, the Hammonds started a strategic emergency backfire on their private land, which successfully saved their winter grazing areas, protected their home and barns, and potentially saved thousands of acres of public land from being engulfed in the wind-driven flames. The 2006 backburn slightly encroached onto the adjacent public land, an estimated 1 acre. The jury concluding it cost less than $1,000 in damage. The Bureau of Land Management pursued criminal charges for the 2006 fire, for the backburn, in state court, but the district attorney reviewed the facts and declined to press charges. So that was 2006. And then, in 2010, just before the statute of limitations ran out on that 2001 fire, the one that improved the range, the BLM brought the Hammonds into federal court, indicting them on numerous charges relating to both fires. The BLM avoided bringing charges under their own statutes, which specifically provide an exception for crimes related to fires started by ranchers who own grazing allotments in certain circumstances. 18 U.S.C. subsection 1855 says, this section shall not apply in the case of a fire set by an allottee in the reasonable exercise of his property rights on the allotment. So they didn't use that statute because it wouldn't result in a mandatory prison sentence. Normally, the BLM would cite a rancher with a trespass burn under its own statutes. That's the applicable citation. But instead of that, federal prosecutors charged Dwight and Stephen Hammond as arsonists under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. This is the law that was enacted in response to Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. They applied that law to these two ranchers. Eventually, all of the federal government's claims about the ranchers lighting fires on public lands and endangering federal employees and attempting to destroy government vehicles were proven unfounded. The jury said not guilty. 10 of the 13 most egregious charges against the Hammonds were either dismissed or concluded in the jury's not guilty verdict. The one count that Dwight was found guilty of related solely to the 2001 prescribed burn, which was ignited on the Hammonds' private land after his son Stephen had called the BLM dispatcher asking, quote, if it was okay to burn private land in the Steens Mountain area that day. And the BLM dispatcher on duty told Stephen at that time, quote, it was okay, that there were no burning restrictions anymore, unquote. This from the trial records. Whereas, in the end, the Hammonds were only found to have been involved in 2 range management fires that they had started on their own land and conducted in accordance with standard techniques that are common among ranchers, farmers, and public land managers in the area. The federal district court judge that heard the case declared, quote, it would be cruel and unusual punishment for this crime to give them the mandatory minimum of 5 years, unquote, as required under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. In fact, the judge issued a sentence of 1 year for Stephen and 90 days for Dwight, and he even allowed the men to serve staggered terms so they could continue to keep the family ranch afloat. But after finally succeeding in a conviction against the Hammonds, albeit minuscule, the federal government filed an outrageous claim for damages in the amount of $1.3 million in a civil suit. And then they offered, in what many would say, and I would agree, amounts to extortion, to drop all charges on the condition that the Hammonds sign over 2/3 of their ranch to the federal government. Facing perhaps the largest and most well-funded law firm in the world, the United States government, and under extreme duress, the Hammonds agreed to a plea that would lower the fine from $1.3 million to $400,000 and require that they give the BLM the first right of refusal to purchase their ranch if for some strange reason they were ever required to sell it. The Hammonds paid the fine and they served out the sentences that the judge had handed down of 1 year for Stephen and 90 days for Dwight. But then the federal government pressed forward with another criminal, on more criminal charges, or on the same criminal charges, but to an appeal for resentencing, asking for the full force of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act to be applied to these men. in a relentless effort to lock Dwight and Stephen up for a full 5 years. The very sentence the federal district court judge had declined to apply, saying such a harsh punishment under the circumstances, quote, would shock the conscience, unquote. And that's what happened. People's consciences were shocked. In what many in the West and across the nation view it as a manifest miscarriage of justice, very much akin to double jeopardy, Dwight and Stephen Hammond were indeed resentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and they were required to serve their sentences at the same time, making it impossible for them to help keep the family ranch going. They remain incarcerated to this day. Although the Hammonds went away quietly and declined to protest, declined to publicly criticize under threat, they didn't participate with the march and the protest, the march that happened in Burns, Oregon, nor did they condone the takeover of the wildlife refuge. But numerous Americans knew something was very, very wrong, and they risked their lives in a symbolic occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge to bring a national spotlight to the plight of the Hammonds and to request a peaceful redress of many other grievances concerning the federal government's